Okay, so let's take a look at how to tackle this function. As we see, it returns the store. So obviously, we just return a new view instance from it. And first thing we need to do is look at the API requirements. So we need to be able to access this state on the store via store.state. So it seems pretty obvious that we can just put the state here. That allows us to access store.state directly, and it's reactive, which is great. And the other part of the API is this commit method, right? So obviously we can make a commit method here, and the implementation is, then we look at what arguments does it take. It takes the ID of the mutation. So it's like mutation type or something. And we notice that we are destructuring the mutations object from our declaration here, and mutation is just an object with different keys. And so mutations, mutation type. This will give us the corresponding function, which is this inc function here. And notice that this inc function needs to be passed the state, so it needs to be passed here. And now we've essentially complete the picture. So yeah, pretty straightforward. The real thing to note here is that the step from going to a bare bone view instance to how we can use that, wrap it up with some utility functions, and eventually expose a different API. So for this small exercise, our new create store API doesn't really make things fundamentally more useful than a simple view instance. But this is really just to demonstrate how Vuex is, in fact, Vuex is implemented in a very similar fashion, but we can add more functionalities to it. For example, Vuex has a concept of actions, getters, modules, and building upon that. But at the root of it, at the core of Vuex, is still this reactivity system driven by view instances. Hopefully you kind of get an idea of, you can leverage the same pattern, tweak the API to the state that you like to create an alternative state management solution to your liking. So that's totally possible. And I really recommend people to experiment and just fiddle with these because it really helps you understand how a state management library that looks really fancy and powerful are in fact composed of these little bits. They're all built from these common primitives. Okay, so much for Vuex. The next exercise, I want to sort of just switch gears and talk about something functional, right? So if you're familiar with both Vue and React, you probably know that React is in general, its ecosystem and its community is in general much more into functional programming. And Redux is a very good example of that sort of preference, because the whole premise of Redux is that your app state is immutable, right? So if we have an initial state of count 0, similar to how Vuex takes different mutations, Redux takes different action types, and the core concept in Redux is called something called a reducer. So a reducer is a function that looks like this, and reducer takes state. So this is pref state and action. And it does something. So what it does is the reducer will return a whole new copy of your state using the previous state and the action type. And because this is just one big function, right? So we'll do a big switch statement. Switch action, case increment. We will return count pref state.count plus 1. And case decrement, we will return. Why is count pref state.count minus 1. And because we have return statements here, I'm not going to do the, oh, there's an extra column here. I'm not going to do the break because the return statement kind of does that already. And if it's default, just return pref state. Or you can throw an error, like unknown action type. But the idea is pretty simple. You have a previous state, and your next state is always constructed on top of the previous state based on what action type you receive. So this is very functional because it takes some arguments, returns something new, and it's not mutating anything in place. But in effect, when you apply this to a state management pattern, it achieves the same end effect in terms of in your component, where both dispatching and action send it to the central store. Something happens in the store, your state gets updated, either replaced or mutated, and eventually that change is reflected as side effects. And the side effect in a front-end app is updates in the DOM. Right? So this is the essence of Redux. Right? So we can apply very similar concepts to a Vue app. If this is the API type of API you prefer, we can totally do that in Vue as well. So let's look at our exercise and look at the desired API. So this interface is in fact inspired from, so this kind of combines influence from Redux and a few other libraries. There is a library called HyperApp, which exposes almost exactly this interface, and I believe the True also looks very similar to this. But the idea is you sort of have this model, which is same as state, and then you have possible actions, and these actions, each of these actions take so these actions are like essentially, they receive the previous state as the argument and they return the next state. Okay? So instead of switch statement, we still break them into separate functions. But all of them receive your state as the argument and returns the next new state. And your view is a function that receives 3 arguments. The h is our render function argument. And then there's the model that's directly passed into your render function. And your actions are also passed into the render functions. So everything is passed into your function as arguments. This is like as functional as it can get. And what you need to do, when you need state, you reference it on the model. When you need things to change, you trigger functions on your actions, right? So here you can see that we are passing, so this is the syntax for handling events in render functions. You use the on nested under your data object, and inside that you do on, click, and pass it a function to call when the button is clicked. So eventually, this is what we want to achieve. Really, like, the whole exercise is about given a desired API, how do you use existing primitive to present that API, to create something that satisfies that API. And this is, in fact, totally feasible within the Vue context. And if you've looked at the reference implementation, it can be as short as down to 12 lines of code. So yeah, let's try that. Let's try it for 10 minutes and see how everyone's doing, and we'll see whether we need more time for that.
There was a question in chat. I don't know if you want to address it.
Which one are you? So there are a few questions. So the TypeScript question says, read about Vue class component and decorators. Yes, these are officially supported and recommended ways to use TS with Vue, but we are also planning some upgrades to the type system in 2.5, which allows you to get proper type inference even using the default Vue API. So by then, Vue class component will be strictly optional for TypeScript users, but if you prefer a type-based API, you should probably still use it. Next question is, do you have any hints or good practices how to design complex store? Or having nested object is a good idea? Or maybe having flash structure is better? There really isn't a apply everywhere rule for designing this. We designed and shipped the module feature for Vuex to sort of help you divide your big store into very clear units that you can then recompose together. Having nested objects really isn't, I don't think there's any particular downside to it, but having a flash structure, I wouldn't necessarily say one is better than the other. It really depends on your use case, like what your data structure is, what you're dealing with. So I think this might be too generic to answer, and it's hard to discuss without concrete requirements of the app. But there's this, so in Redux, there's this common practice of so-called normalizing your data. And by normalizing, it means it makes it flat, in that when you have one type of entity that's referring to another, similar to columns, similar to tables in a relational database, instead of embedding another entity directly into a parent entity, you will store them in different collections and then reference each other using entity IDs. So it sort of makes the store more like a relational database of sorts, which I think is probably a good idea if your data model is particularly complex. So that's I would actually think that's a better way to organize things if you can successfully model your data structure that way, then you should probably go for it. Yeah. Question, what do you think of creating data files for specific states with specific modifying functions? Yeah, that seems totally fine to me. This is in fact very similar to how you would probably split different modules into different files in Vuex as well. I'm just speaking to the chat. But yeah, I think we can cut out for a bit.